does it have to be that way? We can wave a wand and move beyond the ancient endless cycle that has proved a dismal failure over and over and over.
Hello, friends, and welcome to World Citizen Wire, broadcasting from Fayetteville, Arkansas. I'm your host, Abel Tomlinson. The theme song is Optimist Anthem by folk musicians Still on the Hill. Our guest today is the brilliant Iraq War veteran, Matthew Hoh, of Veterans for Peace. I became aware of this leader after watching an excellent video of him participating with the new Poor People's Campaign, speaking on transforming the war economy and many other things. It's fitting that we speak on this today, not long after Martin Luther King Day, for Dr. King was killed during the original Poor People's Campaign, and Reverend William Barber and many others are resurrecting it with big plans for nationwide civil disobedience in 2018. I now want to play a short interview with Matthew Hoh speaking at this Poor People's Campaign event.
I went to Iraq twice and Afghanistan once, and on that third time to Afghanistan, that was where I could no longer go along with the killing, where I could no longer go along with the lies, where I could no longer come home and go to another funeral and tell a mother that her son's death was worth it, excuse me. And the lies over and over again, the rationalizations. One of the things that I've come to realize is that what our state religion is a state religion of militarism. What you see and what you do and what you experience is this hero worship, where we are basically these acolytes of this religion. And so we are untouchable. And so anything I do, I am thanked for. When the realities of my service, if you want to call it that, which you can't call it that, because the realities of it, the sum and total of it, is the death, is the killing I took part in both places, whether directly or indirectly. And that has affected me when I came home from my second time in Iraq. The moral crisis I had, the moral injury is a term that's used now, the guilt, which is what I believe drives most of the suicides that we see in the veterans community, is the guilt. And we know this from studies. We know this, the VA has done plenty of studies on this. They knew this as early as 1990, that the best predictor of suicide in Vietnam veterans was combat-related guilt. But for what happens to me, though, is this, when you lose that, when you lose who you think you are, because you've taken part in something that was so wrong, this killing, it rips the moral foundations out of you. It rips your moral spine away. And so the descent goes quickly to suicidality. And that's something I've been dealing with for 10 years now, and I manage it and I cope with it, but it still comes back. It's a condition I'll have for the rest of my life. But this is the cost of taking part in the killing. And we see this as well, too. You know, it's no coincidence, and it comes from this culture in this country of violence-based solutions, of militarism. It's no coincidence that we've killed 1 million to 1.5 million people in these wars since 2001, and we have the highest murder rate in the world, right? It's no coincidence that we have the highest incarceration rate. Or when you see things like...
We have this phenomenon of mass shootings, which
Absolutely.
doesn't exist in other places.
Absolutely. Or not taking care of our people. It's no coincidence that the day Trump announces the largest weapons deal to Saudi Arabia, $300 billion, is the same day that his people in the White House say, we're going to cut Medicaid and food stamps by $700 billion. No coincidence.
You know, I'm a Baptist preacher, and I've spent my whole life listening to conversion stories. You know, we talk about how folk got born again. You strike me as someone who's had a conversion experience. I mean, you were talking about a kind of civil religion that you don't believe in anymore. And I wonder, you know, as you're turned away from that, we're talking in this Poor People's Campaign about the need for a moral revival. You know, you're talking about this kind of moral center that's missing in our society. What are you turning towards? What kind of draws you and gives you hope as you think about where we're headed?
It's what I see sitting here in front of me, all you people. It's the work I've been fortunate to do through various organizations, whether with Veterans for Peace or with Code Pink or Iraq Veterans Against the War. But taking part in something that I didn't know existed anymore, my soul, and the utility of love, and understanding what moves this world and the camps that move the world, in which we have a choice to be in. We can either be in the camp of violence, the camp of money, or we can be in the camp of one another and love. And there's never been a time where it's been more real, the consequences.
Now, I want to give a proper introduction to Matthew Hoh. Matt has nearly 12 years' experience with America's wars overseas, with the U.S. Marine Corps, the Department of Defense, and the State Department. He's been a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy since 2010. In 2009, Matthew resigned in protest from his post in Afghanistan with the State Department over the American escalation of the war. Prior to his assignment in Afghanistan, Matthew took part in the American occupation of Iraq. First in 2004 and 5 in Saladin Province with the State Department, and then in 2006 and 7 in Anbar Province as a Marine Corps company commander. When not deployed, Matthew worked on Afghanistan and Iraq war policy and operations issues at the Pentagon and State Department from 2002 to 8. Matthew's writings have appeared in numerous online periodicals such as the Defense News, The Guardian, Huffington Post, USA Today, Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post. He's been a guest on many news and radio programs, including BBC, CBS, CNN, Fox, NBC, NPR, Pacifica, and RT, as well as Democracy Now! In 2010, Matthew was named the Ridenhour Prize recipient for truth-telling. Matthew is also a board member of Exposed Facts, North Carolina Committee to Investigate Torture, Veterans for Peace, and World Beyond War. He's also a member of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, or VIPS. I'm very pleased to introduce Matthew Hoh now, and I was deeply moved by the Poor People's Campaign video that we played earlier, where Matthew and others spoke about transforming the war economy. I understand there's many events planned for 2018 with actions in numerous state capitals. I was wondering if, Matt, you could tell us a little more about the Poor People's Campaign and these kinds of actions and whatever you know about this campaign.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for having me on, Abel. The Poor People's Campaign that is being run through the Kairos Center, as well as Repairers of the Breach, are the two main organizations that are sponsoring the Poor People's Campaign. Although if you go to the website, if you Google Poor People's Campaign, Poor People's Movement, this will come up, or Repairers of the Breach, or the Kairos Center. You'll see that there's also a whole heck of a lot of other organizations that are sponsoring and a part of this movement, including an organization I belong to, Veterans for Peace. But this Poor People's Campaign really is the brainchild, I feel, of Reverend William Barber, who is, perhaps the greatest living American, in my opinion, right now. And really, as a number of people, including Cornel West, have said, the heir or the living Martin Luther King that we have, this generation's Martin Luther King. And I was living in North Carolina the last 5 years and got to be around Reverend Barber quite a bit and learn from him, be inspired by him, take part in some of his actions down there. This Poor People's Campaign is an antecedent or a follow-up to the moral movement that Reverend Barber began in North Carolina in 2013, I believe, which has seen the largest civil disobedience movement in decades in the United States. Since the Civil Rights Movement, this is the largest civil disobedience movement in terms of number of people who've been arrested. And we've had over 1,000 people in North Carolina arrested at the State House because of the grossly unfair, cruel, and illegal, unconstitutional measures that the State House in North Carolina has enacted over the last decade or so. Mm-hmm. But the genesis of the Poor People's Campaign, of course, comes from Martin Luther King and the civil rights. And in the last year or two of his life, as Martin Luther King began to speak more aggressively about issues other than straight-on civil rights, he began to speak more aggressively about poverty and about militarism. He gets into the three triplets of evil, as he denounces it a year before he's killed: racism, poverty, and war.
And that's in the Beyond Vietnam speech, right?
Exactly. And if you've never seen the Beyond Vietnam speech from, I think it was April 4th of 1967 at Riverside Church in New York City.
Right.
Yeah, stop listening to me. You come back, of course, to Abel's show, but stop listening to me and go watch that speech or read that right now.
Yeah.
But that's where this Poor People's Campaign comes out of.
Right.
And that's legacy that being carried forward, and along the same type of principle of mass civil disobedience, as well as bringing together people from all stratuses, all spheres, all levels within the United States.
Right.
It's, if you know, you're a Howard Zinn fan, the very foundation of the United States of pitting the poor whites versus the black slaves, and how that has continued throughout our history and politics. And that's something that the Poor People's Campaign really wants to achieve, is to knock down that barrier between poor and working class whites and poor and working class blacks and poor and working class Hispanics, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, I'm very inspired about this transformation of the war economy, because to me that seems like such a fundamental issue in so many ways. It just and then it even harkens back to Isaiah 2:4. And you had the plowshares movement, transforming weapons of war and swords to plowshares, and studying war no more. So I can't help but be inspired by those kinds of things.
Yeah, and there's also too a very logical and sound reasoning for this. I mean, this goes back. We've seen this in presidents. Whether it was, everyone is aware of President Eisenhower's military-industrial complex and the great speech he gives about how every bomber and every warship we build means X amount less schools, right? And that's true, because even though it's not a tangible one-off, it's not like Congress is sitting there and saying we're going to build these F-35 fighter planes, so we're not going to fund these schools. That spirit is there. That attitude is there. That climate is there. Of we are going to choose violence-based solutions. And as long as we have a culture that endorses and embraces violence-based solutions, whether it be this massive military we have, this being the world's largest arms dealer, or whether we're a nation that has over 300 million guns and the largest prison population in the world, it's all violence-based solutions. And that is antithetical to a just nation. That is antithetical to a nation that's going to take care of its own people. So that's where you see these trade-offs really occurring. But it is true, the amount of money that we seek into the defense budget, if that money was repurposed, if you were going to do this straight trade-off, and a great place to go is the National Priorities Project. They keep kind of a running tally of all this, and that will actually tell you how many school teachers can be funded for a year for the cost of one $100 million F-35 fighter plane. There are all those metrics, but the key thing is what we do know from places like Brown University and UMass Amherst, as well as, say, like the think tank I belong to, a guy named Bill Hartung, who works there, Center for International Policy. These folks have all done the research and shows that the money we sink into defense, the money we sink into building warplanes and tanks and missiles and warships, that is the least efficient way, the least productive way of creating jobs. If you put that money, and by a significant amount, a significant ratio. So it is the war economy on multiple levels, whether it's on the actual levels of the trade-off and what we could do with that money if we weren't spending it on defense, or the spiritual legacy that we're burdened with because we are embracing violence-based solutions, both at home and abroad. That has a very real impact on where our nation is heading. And as I mentioned, the president, where everyone is aware of Eisenhower and his military-industrial complex speech, but also, too, John F. Kennedy turns away in the last year of after the Cuban Missile Crisis, turns away from being a Cold War warrior and turns towards reducing the military, trying to resist the overtures into Vietnam, as well as seeing the tangles the defense spending would bring. Lyndon Johnson doesn't run again for a second term because of the Vietnam War, because that has destroyed his chances for a great society. Right. Yeah, I mean, so we have seen this over and over again. And then, of course, Martin Luther King. But so, I mean, for 50, 60 years, we've been dealing with these trade-offs.
Yeah, and I'd also like to ask you about, you spoke about the connection between cultural militarism and violence in our streets. I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about that, especially since I saw some statistic that there has been, for instance, 11 school shootings in 23 days this month. So that's essentially one every other day. And, you know, there has to be some kind of cultural explanation for this. I wonder if you could speak on that a little bit.
I think we were a nation that was born in violence, whether it be because we had to acquire our lands from the Native Americans. We were a nation that grew in prosperity through the enslavement of Africans.
Right.
Right. We have this great mythology of which a lot of it is true, of our revolution, that we are a nation born out of violence. We preserved our nation by the Civil War, and we ended slavery through the Civil War. As David Swanson points out, you know, we're like the only nation that ended slavery by killing 600,000 of our people or more. You know, everyone else seemed to end slavery through other means, you know, peaceful means or legal means. So we have this, and then of course you have the great myths of the Wild West, and you have this great idea of the frontiersman. So we are a nation where we have a legacy and we have a history and we have a culture within that of violence. That violence provides these solutions. Right. And so you see that too as well with, even look at the early presidents that we have and going on throughout. I mean, you had George Washington, you had Andrew Jackson, you had Zach Tyler. I mean, you had a tradition early on of electing military men as leaders of the country. Same thing. Then you get Grant and Garfield and on, right? I mean, like Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, so you have this tradition within the U.S. of turning towards military leaders, and not just turn towards military leaders, but of worshiping them, of deifying them to a certain degree. And then, of course, you see it now with our military. It's the most respected institution in the United States. I mean, we could talk all night about the various issues and problems of the U.S. military, but it's a military that has been involved in these awful wars, that has not won a war since World War II, and even World War II. I mean, come on, the Russians won that war. Right. You know, I mean, like, so there's a false sense of regard for the military. Again, an institution that has lost $10 trillion over the last 30 years. An institution where if you're a woman and you go into the military, 1 in 3 women during their service, and most services about 4.5 years long, 1 in 3 are raped or sexually assaulted. So there's this veneration that is not rightful, but we continue to do it. And it is. There's a very real connection between our culture and then the policies that are enacted, whether they be the policies on our streets, this concept of law and order, the way that we maintain peace at home is with weapons and with prisons, that there is, even for issues such as substance abuse, the answer is incarceration. It's not treatment. Even for mental health issues, the answer is incarceration or institutionalization, not treatment. We don't put the focus into that, right? And then, of course, overseas, we are clearly focused on military means as our way forward.
Right. It seems like a lot of our laws, and we expect our society to function on threats of fear and threats of violence, and instead of being based on love, like you were kind of saying at the Poor People's Campaign event. And if I could read a quick quote by King, and Dr. King, he said, by our readiness to allow arms to be purchased at will and fired at whim, by allowing our movies and television screens to teach our children that the hero is one who masters the art of shooting and the technique of killing, by allowing all these things, all these developments, we have created an atmosphere in which violence and hatred have become popular pastimes. So I don't know. Do you think that our media, it seems like a lot of our films and TV shows and video games and even children's toys, a lot of them, do you think that those things help to create this cultural violence? Or
I think they do. I mean, I know there's been, there's not the things I've seen, the research I've seen on it, doesn't seem to be a very clear link.
Okay.
Certainly grew up watching Tom and Jerry and,
right.
The Roadrunner. And I don't know, was that why I joined the Marine Corps? I don't think so. I think it's more innate than that. It's more in our mythology that goes to like what Walter Wink described as the myth of redemptive violence. That this is in deeper stories. That it's a story of how we settled the Wild West, or the story of how we defeated Hitler. That violence was the only way to answer those problems. But I do think that it is true. You have characters on television, in the movies, that their solutions are only with their fists or with a rifle, or by blowing something up, and that is the only way to achieve victory or to resolve a problem. Of course, I think where I'm most critical of those kinds of things, of the violence in the films, is that it doesn't show the cyclical nature of violence. It doesn't show, it doesn't show the lasting effects of violence. Even if you're watching a police drama and a police officer is shot, in the next episode, he's okay.
Right.
Well, it doesn't show the months and months or maybe years of physical therapy that police officer, that he or she needs to go through. It doesn't show the PTSD that is going to come from being shot. It doesn't show the anguish that his or her family goes through by almost losing somebody.
Right.
Let alone, too, you just have this notion that that's how you quash the bad guy, when we know that that's not the case. We know that revenge cycles are real. They exist, and that by killing one person does not mean the end of whether it is a family organization or a professional organization like a mafia type organization. There is someone who is going to replace that person, and so those issues are never the lack of violence bill, the answer, or the nature, and the fact that it doesn't end, it continues on, and it not only continues on, but I feel that violence tends to broaden out and cover a larger area, or a larger spectrum for the violence. So as you commit violence, and as the next person commits violence, the area that the violence affects is a broader area, is a deeper area.
Right.
That is never covered in television. That is never covered in the movies.
There's not enough sort of the issue of humanization and dehumanization. I mean, it just doesn't seem like a lot of times that we maybe humanize the people that may have to go through, that suffer from a lot of our wars.
Yeah, and the thing about it too is but they continue to go on the wars. We assign the wars a noble cause. We assign the wars a noble purpose. We say that if we're not fighting them over there, then we'll be fighting them here. Right. Who they are, who them are. This fuzzy terrorist, this caricature of pure evil. But the reality is, as we know from a number of studies, including a United Nations study that was just done again, that the United Nations just did or published in October for Africa, we know that about 3 out of 4, or even 80%, in 2009, the Boston Globe published a leaked a paper from within the U.S. intelligence community about the makeup of the Afghan Taliban, and this found 90% of the Afghan Taliban fitted this actual model. And the model is, as someone who joins the Taliban, in this recent United Nations study, it was for men who joined Boko Haram in Nigeria, or Al-Shabaab in Somalia, or say Islamic State in Libya. Men who join those organizations, 3 out of 4 are joining those organizations because they or their families or fellow or friends of theirs have been victims of government or foreign military violence. Like I said, in 2009, as we were escalating the war in Afghanistan, the Boston Globe published leaked information that our intelligence assessment was 9 out of 10 Taliban were part of the Taliban for those kinds of reasons, because their family members have been victims of violence, or they were fighting for nationalist reasons to get rid of foreign occupation.
That seems like a core point, is, because a lot of Americans think, we're over there fighting for freedom or whatever, democracy, but it seems like, The Intercept ran some good articles recently. There's a guy that did these video articles that showed how our wars and drones are actually increasing terrorism. So this idea that our wars and occupations and drone strikes are actually amplifying terrorism, they're not solving it. So I just feel like that point can't be reiterated enough, that we're being counterproductive. If we really want to defeat terrorism, then we have to try some other approach, obviously.
Absolutely. But then if you admit that, then what about the suffering of our brave men and women, right? If you admit that, then you have to acknowledge that the suffering, whether it be the deaths, the maiming, the mental problems, the PTSD and the traumatic brain injury, et cetera, that they are incurring those for not a noble reason, for not a good reason, for not a worthy reason. And that's something that no politician would ever embrace. And most Americans don't want to embrace, don't want to look into the mirror. Because again, so much of us base ourselves on this mythology of, needing violence as a remedy, as a violence, as redemptive violence, as violence is going to fix a situation. Now, where, of course, the disconnect really occurs and where everything really breaks apart is, as you brought up, Abel, we've had, like you said, 11 school shootings in 23 days or whatever so far this year. And I saw what the numbers were for 2017, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but tragically, it is close to one a day, in terms of school shooting. Maybe it's one every other day or something like that. And it's gone unnoticed. It is just absolutely not spoken about because it's so commonplace. And it really, I think that really probably speaks the most about us, who we are as a nation, that we can't catch this demon that we've unleashed.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really liked a lot of your words that you said in that interview too about PTSD, and you kind of opened my eyes a little bit more to it, 'cause I have several veteran friends that some of them suffer from PTSD, and you may know Jacob George. He's from here in Northwest Arkansas. Did the Ride Till the End, and he sadly took his own life. But so it's an issue that is something I've thought about, and a lot of people here have been affected by. One important point I thought you brought up was how there may be a distinction between PTSD as being a traumatic trauma, and the other side of the coin being the guilt that you talked about. And I never made that kind of dichotomy there, that there may be two things going on here, and one of them could be, what the differences in those are, and what those, the complications that each one of those brings.
Yeah, and on top of that too, there's also a traumatic brain injury, which is something that, and the comorbidity, the fact that those are occurring. Both of those things are occurring in a lot of veterans. We have a lot of service members who are surviving attacks in these wars who wouldn't have survived previous wars. One thing people aren't aware of, Iraq and Afghan veterans have seen more combat than any previous generation of veterans. Something like, depending upon the study you look at, between 60 and 80% of Iraq and Afghan veterans have seen combat. The next highest was, I think, World War II veterans, who were around 50%. It is just and so many of them are surviving these attacks because of the vehicle armor and the body armor we have now, as well as the medical care that they wouldn't have survived before. But getting back to what we discussed, the difference between post-traumatic stress disorder and the guilt or moral injury, as a lot of folks refer to it as. The post-traumatic stress disorder is a natural phenomenon. It is the consequence of you going through a traumatic episode and your body's survival mechanism basically being stuck open. The valve is stuck open, and you're continuing to produce cortisol and adrenaline and other types of survival chemicals, and you can't turn it off. That's why you have that hyperarousal, you have that hypersensitivity. You don't want to sit with your back to the door. You're constantly scanning everybody because for 7 months or 9 months or a year, or for some guys 15 months, every day you went out and hunted other people and other people hunted you. Mm-hmm. And so your survival mechanism, that limbic system in your body, was not built to be on every day like that. And so it basically malfunctions and stays open. And that's the basis of combat-related PTSD. Very similar to, say, somebody who grew up in a house where they were abused. Mm-hmm. And every morning when they woke up, they were ready to be attacked or abused or assaulted or molested or whatever. Same type of thing. Our bodies, our survival systems were meant to be used sparingly to fight off the saber-toothed tiger that was attacking your cave. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So every once in a while. But now the other side of that is what you're talking about, what I think drives so much, and many other people think drives so much of the veteran suicides. And just to give you an example of how high that is, within Iraq and Afghan veterans, male Iraq and Afghan veterans who were in their 20s or age 18 to 29, so our youngest veterans from the Iraq and Afghan war, their suicide rate is nearly 6 times higher than young men their same age who didn't go to war. Mm-hmm. Give you an idea of how bad that suicide rate is. But what we see, what a lot of we feel is that this is based upon guilt, that there is a moral breakdown, a moral deconstruction, this moral injury, that you went there because you thought you were going to do something, and that you would only commit such an act of violence or take part in violence. Interestingly, for the guilt to really have an effect, you don't have to be the one to pull the trigger. You just have to be associated with it. Mm-hmm. And then you learn that what you did was not right, was not just, was not moral. And you have this breakdown that I went through it, and I can tell you it is the worst experience you could possibly imagine. The foundations, the moral structure of your life has collapsed, and you are in just where suicide is the option, is the way to escape, is the way for relief, because that pain is so difficult. And so this moral injury is something that has plagued veterans forever, has plagued people who have gone to war forever, this unjust killing. We see it in drone operators, people who aren't going to combat, who are driving to the Air Force Base in Nevada or in New York, getting out of cars, going into a building, conducting a drone strike, killing somebody from 8,000 miles away with a joystick on a computer screen, mm-hmm. getting in the car and going home and eating dinner with their family. Those men and women are suffering the same kinds of guilt effects and moral injury effects that traditional combat veterans will see. It's very dangerous. It's very destructive. It is, as I said, the complete breakdown of who you thought you were and who you thought you would be. It's akin to survivor guilt in a lot of ways. It's that you failed to do something else. Someone else was taking that type of just existential destruction. Mm-hmm. It's something that will always plague people who go to war, particularly these kinds of wars where at the end of it, you realize what you did was not just. You were taken, was not worthwhile or, legal, right. or just.
Well, there seems like there's this big disconnect of, what people imagine war is like, or what the recruiters tell them it's like, and what the actual reality is. I know one example of a biography of a guy I've been reading, Gary Davis, who he was he led the World Citizen Movement, which was part of the reason the name of this show. He thought that world citizenship would help bring peace, but he was a bomber during World War II, and he had this idea in his head that he was going to go over there and drop bombs on munitions factories, Hitler's. Sure. But he got over there and they told him to bomb cities full of civilians, and after the war he felt horrible about it and led this big world citizen movement that it was inspiring to me. I don't know, can you tell us a little more about that kind of what do recruiters do? Do they create this false reality for young kids that are joining?
Oh, absolutely. And even too, you see it Paul Fussell, who was a Harvard. He fought in World War II as an American infantryman in Europe. Survived the European theater. Only fought against German infantry. But at the end of the war, within months, they were retraining those same Germans that they had been told to kill, that they had killed, in order to prepare them to fight the Russians. Right. And he talks about this. He ended up becoming a great literary critic at Harvard and everything else. But he, in his book, The Making of a Skeptic, I believe was the book, he speaks of this, having that moral injury from that, of being betrayed. Right. You told me I had to kill those people, and now you told me we're going to rearm them. So you don't even have to be dropping bombs on civilians. You can be killing other combatants and still experience this moral injury. Because take a young man who goes and fights in Iraq, he kills someone who points a rifle at him, or in Afghanistan. Well, when you come home and realize that person, that other young man, was only doing that because you were occupying his country. Right. Well, exactly that type of moral that moral destruction occurs. But you were, excuse me, you were. What was your? You had asked me about.
Just about recruiters. I mean, what are they telling? I mean, because I've never really talked to recruiters much. I don't know what they're telling young kids to get them to join.
It's recruiters will tell a kid whatever they have to tell them to enlist, but they often. It depends upon who they're trying to recruit and for what positions. Right. Very often you see them recruiters going into black neighborhoods, and they bring up the money for college. They bring up the skills you're going to learn. This will help you get a job. Right. There tends to be among Hispanics when they recruit Hispanic kids or Latino kids. They tend to say trades. When you get it, you're going to learn how to drive a truck, or you're going to learn how to do construction, or you're going to, and I'm always talking about the money for college as well. Which
I almost joined for the college money.
Extremely low percentage of ever actually use that money. It's a shame how few actually do. And then it seems to be as well that for when they go into the white schools, they tend to push more the patriotism, the glory, the go and defend your country, the adventure. As well as the money for college. Right. So you see that they have different tacks for different demographics. What you will see is that you will see them spending most of their time in poorer schools, whether the schools are white, black, or Latino. That they spend they're not going to spend more than the minimum amount required in the wealthier high schools. Right. That they are going to recruit from the poorer high schools. One of the things interesting, you look at the recruiter the statistics. You can go on the Department of Defense web pages. You can look up all this demographic information about the military force. You can figure out how many recruits have blue eyes. They have all that level of information. But when it gets to household income, they do not have that information. What they do is they if you were to join up, they would say your household income is the median income, either the median or the average income for your zip code. Right. Because if they actually wrote down what the average incomes were for these recruits, you would see that this was a poverty draft, that this was a wage draft, that this was a draft because these young men and women don't have much else to do. This is a way for them to escape, to find something else. As well as, too, that they're not recruiting from the middle classes, and certainly not from the upper middle class and the wealthy classes. There's outliers. There are people who do go, from those classes. But for the most part, the recruiters concentrate, and they tell them whatever they want to tell. They are trained to talk to a young man or woman and find out what interests them. And so I'm talking to you, Abel. I'm a recruiter. I found out you like dogs, and I will talk to you about the military team program and promise you that you'll get to work with dogs, right. Or whatever it is, they will tell you, because they have to provide 4 recruits a month or 5 recruits a month or 7 recruits a month or whatever their number is. And at least it was in the Marine Corps. If you did not if you did not provide the number of recruits that you were required to each month, right? So say it was only 3, you didn't get your 3 recruits in that month, you had a very good possibility of receiving what was called an adverse fitness report, which means you got a negative evaluation, which would ruin your chances for promotion.
Right.
So there are plenty of guys who are in the Marine Corps who never got promoted because 1 month during their recruiting period, they didn't send as many kids to recruit training as they were supposed to.
Right.
And that's why there's this pressure on them to lie. Well, but also too, it's an institution of violence, so of course the lies come hand in hand with it. But you have this extra pressure to lie because the stakes for the recruiters are so high. It can mean whether or not they get promoted or not.
I had another question. A psychoanalyst, social philosopher I really appreciate, Eric Fromm. He wrote a couple books that I really like. He wrote The Sane Society and On Disobedience. And just on the idea that, Fromm argued that there's a danger for humankind that not so much capitalism or communism, but for humans to become robotic. And so there's this idea of obedience and humans becoming robots. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about that, because I've never been in the military, so I don't understand this. This whole idea of, or a policeman having to enforce an unjust law. To follow orders no matter what. I mean, does that not make you lose your humanity to some degree, or?
It certainly does. I mean, the first thing that happens in military training is the de-individualization, like taking away the individual, right? So they bring these kids together, these young men and women together, and they break them down. They make them into a single mass, and that's why drill is so important. That's why they march and they do all these precision movements with the rifles and everything to get them to just reflexively obey, because you're breaking down the individual. Now, interestingly enough, to be successful in combat, you have to have initiative, and you have to be able to think out of the box, and you have to be able to think, right? I mean, you're supposed to be able to do, in the military, you're always supposed to be able to do the job of 2 people above you, right? So your boss and your boss's boss, you're supposed to be able to do, no matter what rank you are, because they can get killed, and then you're in charge. Right. So there is this paradox in the military of creating unflinching, robotic, obedient men and women, and also fostering a spirit of initiative that allows people to think out of the box. Now, of course, the former wins. The former is the easiest thing. The former is the way that people stay out of trouble. The former is the best way to go along and get along. And of course, what does that bring about? It brings about groupthink. It brings about a strong belief in the righteousness of the organization and the infallibility of the organization. We are the best Air Force in the world. No one is better. Plus, anyone outside the Air Force can't understand what we're doing, so any critique of us is not valid. And this is why you see things such as last month or 2 months ago, Anand Gopal and Azmat Khan, 2 journalists, did an incredible study in Iraq and in Syria. They found that the United States was undercutting the number of civilians that we were killing with our airstrikes there by a factor of 33. A factor of 33. I mean, this is not missing 1 or 2 or some people not getting counted. This is deliberate undercount. And what you see it in the pilots and the way that the commanders speak about the civilian casualties is that they follow regulations. And if the regulation says that in order for someone to be killed, it has to meet this criteria, it has to be verified by an on-ground United States military presence, by the local government presence. If you set up all this criteria to establish whether or not a person was actually killed by our airstrike, and you have this obeyance, you have this rigidity to regulation, to guidance, and not stepping out of that, and of course the group thing. Well, then that's how these pilots are able to convince themselves that they haven't killed civilians, right? Because it doesn't match up with what the regulations say. In order to even know, they know that they have killed civilians, they're able to hold off on that and have this dissonance in their head. Now, of course, now this gets back to the moral injury. Not everyone can do that. There are those who are strong enough to break through that, those who are independent-minded enough to break through that, those who just can't live with lies like that. But for some people, that doesn't occur until you're out of the Air Force, out of the Navy, out of the Marines, out of the Army, and you're away from that bubble. You're away from that groupthink. You're away from that reinforcement of your views, as well as those regulations that allow you to exist in that world. So it's a fascinating. What you're getting at there, it's a fascinating. It's fascinating to understand how they're able to lie to themselves and do it over and over again. Well, it's because the whole system, the regulations are set up to allow them to support these lies, support these falsehoods, as well as create this rigid, inward-looking groupthink organization.
Right. Well, I mean, and speaking back to the robotism, it's just that, it seems like, Fromm and Joseph Rotblat, a great peace hero, and Bertrand Russell, Albert Einstein, the Einstein-Russell manifesto, they emphasized, remember your humanity. Yeah. And so I just feel like I don't know what more can be done or how to combat robotism. It's just, I guess you just do what you can, but for instance, I mean, it wasn't just Truman that dropped the nuclear bomb. It was also a soldier following an order, the pilot. So,
exactly,
I don't know. Or, you had the Nazi war criminal Eichmann who said that, he was just following orders, so.
So I graduated college in 95, and that's when the internet was kind of coming out, right? And I remember this period, this time where we had this thought, society had this thought that what a great thing it was going to be, how much it was going to open people's minds. People were going to be exposed to concepts and thoughts and ideas and things that they would never even consider before, because everything was now open with the internet. You had access to so much. Mm-hmm. And what we found, right, of course, is that people have just pigeonholed themselves even further. The people that they're on Facebook with are like all the same things that they do. They only watch news from Fox News or only from MSNBC. Like they put themselves in these echo chambers. They reinforce their own beliefs willfully. And so how do you combat that? How do you, as well then too, we have an education system that doesn't teach thinking. It teaches memorization. It teaches correct answers. It teaches doing well on tests as opposed to thinking. And that feeds wonderfully into a militarized society. I mean, and the reflexiveness. I speak a lot about whenever I see, you see somebody, a soldier, and the people who go up to him and or her and just effusively thank them for their service, even though you have no idea what this young man or woman has ever done. Mm-hmm. And the same thing as a veteran. I had this run-in the other day with a woman. She was wearing this military-style coat, and I had said something like, "Yeah, you should use that to get like a discount at the movie theater or whatever." And the look on her face was this shock and horror of, "Oh, I would never do that. I would never," because it's become this. The militarism is one of our religions in this country, and the deification of the military service member, that they are untouchable, that they are infallible, that they are holy. Basically, the look on her face was the same as basically me saying, I'm going to go into the Catholic Church and, give the statue of the Virgin Mary a kiss on the lips. Like, that's patient. And so we have a society that is reinforcing all this.
Right.
Ultimately, this, and we are. How often do we forget? I'm glad you said that, Abel. How often do we forget and do not remember our humanity?
Yeah, I think just teaching children critical thinking and, love is so key, personally. But I had one more question, too. I'm almost running out of time. But recently, Congress passed a $700 billion, they call it a defense budget. I might call it a war complex budget, maybe. But super majorities in both parties voted for this. It was a minority of 60-something Democrats and a couple Republicans that voted against it. And I just wonder if you could tell us more about the power of the defense corporations and everything that are benefiting from this, because, I mean, if you look up, funding of our congressional representatives, really the defense donations aren't nearly as big as, say, Wall Street or
That's right.
big insurance corporations. So I'm wondering how this kind of pressure is applied to our congressmen. I know that there's, Lockheed Martin has, has created jobs in many of the congressional districts that creates kind of that.
The defense industry has done a number of things. One is the placement of jobs. The F-35, right? It's going to cost $1 trillion over, its lifetime. It's a complete disaster. It's just, but it has parts made in every state.
Right.
And they choose, they're manufacturing parts in some districts that host the congressmen or congresswomen who will be likely to vote against it. Mm-hmm. So, example I know is up in Massachusetts, Jim McGovern. I believe, real progressive, great guy, one of my heroes. He's got 400 or 500 people who owe their jobs up there, I believe. At least this was 7 or 8 years ago. Maybe it's changed now. Right. But he's got a number of people up there who owe their jobs to the manufacturer of F-35. They make who knows what they make. They make the bolts that go on the wheel or something. But so they do that. So they spread it so that if they vote against the program, the person who runs against them, their challenger, can say, this guy voted against the job. This woman voted against the job. And you're right. The funding, it's not like all 535 members of Congress are receiving $1 million a year from the defense industry. It doesn't have to be that way. You look at the funding, who's getting campaign funds, it's the committee chair people and the people on the committees. Okay. And that's the same for any industry. If you look at finance, you look at agriculture, you look at pharmaceuticals, it's the same type of playbook where the members of the committee, the relevant committees, are funded to a great deal by the various industries that they have oversight on. Okay. So what you're seeing is with defense is no different than what you see with Wall Street, with agriculture. I mean, how come when I go and buy something, it doesn't tell me, I go to the supermarket, there's hardly any information on the box of cereal about sugar, right? It doesn't tell me how much sugar I'm allowed to have in a day, right? It's because the sugar industry is so powerful. They have blocked that, they have, not allowed that to happen. Why, right? Pizza sauce counts as a vegetable for school children, and so you have, where we see it though, where it plays out, where it's so dastardly, is of course these are weapons of war. These are merchants of death. Mm-hmm. Also, our discretionary income, so much of it goes for defense and to war. With this $700 billion budget now, 60% of our discretionary income our government spends will go towards war, will go towards death. And that doesn't count the CIA, that doesn't count Homeland Security. Right.
Some estimate over $1 trillion total if you include all of it.
Yeah. And I mean, one thing that people always are shocked at is when you talk about how much we spend on debt. And you look at the numbers that War Resisters International and National Priorities Project put out. This year, we'll spend about $115 billion on debt payments for past wars, just this year. We've spent about $600 billion already on debt just on the Iraq and Afghan wars. I mean, so it all adds up. But where the real power that the defense industry has over the politicians is the threat during re-election that they're going to be someone is going to say to them, "You're weak on defense. You didn't support our military. You are a Russian stooge," whatever it is. I mean, you're a tool of the Ayatollah, whatever. But the real fear is that they're going to be up there and they're going to have. How come our young men and women are fighting and dying? You've never served a day in combat, Congressman. How dare you not vote for them? Right. And that's where that's how they have such an outside control, because the politics of it, the politics of our militarism are so strong that members of Congress are terrified of being called not just unpatriotic, but anti-military.
Well, that's why I feel this war economy issue, and that there's a movement actually talking about this that's so inspiring, because it seems like you have to have that message of, we're opposed to war and the war economy, but you have to have something to replace those jobs. We're going to replace these military war jobs with peace economy jobs.
Yeah. So, yeah, very, 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 and that'd be very easy to do, right? I mean, like, you're telling me we can't transition Boeing and Lockheed towards green energy. You know,
Right.
we can't right. I mean, like we can't transition. There's not an ability to do that. You know, the Green Party has in their platform that whole Jill Stein had her whole green, you know, green transformation, green economy. You know, what I mean, there's that. But also too, the United States, we're so geared towards short-term gain. We're so geared towards, you know, the other thing too, not to before I forget it, is the defense industry is also really good at getting people on the media. So if you turn on MSNBC or CNN or Fox, where, you know, or if you read the New York Times, you know, the Washington Post, the people who are commenting on the military very often are, if they're on television, a lot of them are on the boards of directors for various defense industries, defense companies. Or if it's in the Washington Post and the New York Times, they work for these think tanks that are majority funded by the defense industry.
Right, and then there's the interlocking directorates. You know, you have boards of directors of, you know, that are on defense corporation boards or on media corporation boards, and there's all these interlocking systems. I don't know. But I think we're almost out of time, unfortunately, and I just wanted to make sure to highlight, you know, I know you work with Veterans for Peace, and I didn't know if you'd like to tell people a little bit about some of the other work you're doing you'd like them to be aware of. I know they can go to MatthewHoh.com, is that right? Or
MatthewHoh.com. I'm a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy. We're a think tank that does not take corporate money. We have relied upon individual donors. That's not entirely true. Marriott gives us money for a deforestation program. We run a deforestation program in the rainforest in the Amazon. But we are a think tank devoted towards fighting back against militarism, fighting for social justice. I'm also with organizations such as Expose Facts, which is an organization that helps whistleblowers. And I recently just joined the board of directors for another organization called Institute for Public Accuracy, which is an organization that tries to get lesser heard voices onto the radio and television programs. We serve as a booking, it serves as a booking platform or a pitching platform for people who don't have the money to hire the public relation firms to pitch them and book them on television or radio, which is a real thing. That's how the industry works, and you need to do that. Another organization I work with quite a bit is called World Beyond War.
Yeah, with David Swanson.
Yeah, David. It's associated with Roots Action, and it is a fantastic organization. Does a lot, and please go to any of those websites: Expose Facts or World Beyond War, or Veterans for Peace, or Institute for Public Accuracy to learn more about what these organizations are doing.
Yeah, I do read Peace in Our Times, Veterans for Peace magazine.
Yeah, terrific. One of the best quarterly newspapers out there. Really, really great. Yeah. And feel free, those listening and watching, go to Peace in Our Times and check it out.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Matt, and thank you to our World Citizen Wire viewers. You can find past episodes on World Citizen Wire Facebook page, on YouTube, or at my website, abeltomlinson.com. We'll see you next time. May peace and justice prevail.
Yeah, it's true, mankind must work, but that work can have a purpose. We can set upon the daunting task of fixing what is broken. We'll rewire the world with power grids, but don't destroy the earth. Bring an end to war and hunger, and pay workers what they're worth. And the awesome power of doing good will be loosed upon the world, touching every man and woman, touching every boy and girl. And there won't be need for songs that paint the failure of mankind, cause a new song will be ringing in the freedom of our mind. Cause it doesn't have to be that way. We'll just wave a wand and move beyond the ancient endless cycle that has proved a dismal failure over and over.